Do you spend a ton of time training your SDRs only to find that they make the same mistake over and over again, take months to ramp, and have trouble making quota? Yoda AI by ringDNA delivers AI-powered conversation guidance so that every rep can sell like your top performer. In real time, deliver talking points that help reps overcome sales objections, stay on message, and beat the competition. You'll never have to endlessly repeat sales advice to reps again. It's easy to set up, easy to customize, and comes with out-of-the-box coaching best practices. Turn your team into a revenue-driving machine today with Yoda AI by ringDNA. To learn more, visit ringdna.com/Yoda. That's ringdna.com/YODA.
Every time we come up with something like revenue operations in tech, a whole bunch of people will give people that title, but not actually do what it means, right? You see a lot of people with revenue operations in their title right now that are actually just sales ops people. And there's one key difference there, which is sales ops people do ops and enablement for your sales team. They're working with companies that are being driven by sales specifically, and they're really running an old go-to-market strategy where sales is the engine behind everything. Revenue operations is taking a look cross-departmentally. So I'm not just showing up and doing sales op work.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Jordan Henderson. He's the Director of Revenue Operations, otherwise known as RevOps, here at ringDNA. And in our conversation today, we're going to talk about, that's right, revenue operations, RevOps. Now, if you've heard talk about RevOps and you're not exactly sure what it is, then this is the episode for you. Jordan leads off by telling us how and why a lawyer ends up in revenue operations, and then we dive into what RevOps is, why it's such a critical function for sales organizations in our digital selling world. We also dig into what it means to have a revenue operations go-to-market strategy, and then we delve into some predictions about how RevOps will continue to evolve and grow. So we get into this and much, much more. But before we get to Jordan, I just want to remind you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. And if you subscribe, we'd certainly appreciate it if you could also give us your feedback about how we're doing in the form of a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Andy, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So where have you been hanging out during the pandemic?
Right now, I'm actually hanging out in Running Springs, California. I've been traveling around the West Coast, but I actually have a cabin up here, kind of up by Big Bear, and I've spent the last month here and the foreseeable future, which is nice. Get out of the city a little bit. How about yourself?
San Diego, but Big Bear. So do you have kids?
No, nothing that elaborate. I just have a tiny cabin up here. It has pretty good internet, so it's been a nice place to relax.
Yeah, fewer people.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
and less noise. It's nice and quiet.
Yeah, well, I imagine. Yeah, you're in the mountains. People don't know there's very tall mountains just to the east of Los Angeles, and you're sort of up in those.
Yeah, it takes a 90-minute drive from my house in West Hollywood to get up here, and it goes from 100 feet in elevation to 6,000.
6,000, there you go.
In those 90 minutes, so it's quick.
I always like those days in the winter where these cloudless, smogless days where the mountains just appear right there. Suddenly it's like, I've been here a dozen times. I've never seen those mountains before. And then suddenly, whoop, there they are.
Yeah, you forget they're in your backyard.
Yeah. Well, it's much better now, air quality, than it was 20, 30 years ago. So you see them more frequently.
Yeah, I imagine that's true. And you're down in San Diego?
In San Diego, yeah. So not a bad day down here.
No, best weather.
Yeah, maybe the best. So your namesake is one of my favorite football players.
I knew you were going to bring this up.
So well, the audience knows that I'm a big soccer fan. Football, the real football, not the game that no one actually touches the ball with their feet. And one of the star players for Liverpool, my team, is named Jordan Henderson. So have you ever been confused, like gotten messages for him?
Have I ever told you that story about when he was playing in the World Cup?
No.
So,
this was in 2018, the Russia World Cup?
No, it was 2014, I believe. It was much earlier in his career. Yeah, in Brazil. And sort of ironically, and you're a fan, so you'll know, he's roughly the same height as I am, same kind of look, similar haircut, and actually about a year apart in age. So we look kind of strangely similar and have the same name. And so I had a Twitter account at Jordan Henderson, which I no longer have.
I think for reasons we're about to hear.
For reasons you're about to hear, which he in 2014, he had a bit of a rough World Cup. The pretty big disappointment.
Yeah.
And I don't watch football at all. I watch American football. I don't watch a lot of soccer.
I'm sorry. We'll convert you, but go ahead.
Yeah. So one day I go to log into Twitter and I have 80, 90 messages. And I'm sort of confused because I have about that many followers at the time. and turns out he botched a game, and around 90 people decided that they were going to find him on Twitter and let him know how he felt about that. So I just logged into Twitter one day and I had 90 threats and angry messages targeted at Jordan Henderson. And I was like, oh no, what have I done? And it took me talking to somebody before I realized that this person existed, and they were all intended for some soccer player from Liverpool, which was crazy.
Yeah. Now you'll be glad to know. Maybe you follow this, but he's totally redeemed himself. I mean, he is now considered sort of this icon of English football and the leader of the English side. So he's sort of this paragon.
Yeah, I've sort of since then followed his career a little bit, and he seemed like he was really young at the time and just had a rough first World Cup. But
it's a big stage to have.
I haven't gotten any threats since then, so I assume that he's doing a lot better.
Well, now you should start trading on it. That'd be the thing to do.
Yeah. There's been a handful of instances where that's happened, or people have mentioned it. There's even a group of. There's a Facebook group for people who have the same name as famous soccer players, and I've been invited to that a handful of times.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's sort of such a weird organization.
There's something for everyone on Facebook.
It really is.
All right, I'll have to check that one out. That's a little scary.
Yeah.
Well, not scary. Some other stuff there, but that's kind of scary. So, you have sort of an unusual route you've taken to revenue operations. I mean, did you grow up in North Dakota, or was it in Minnesota you grew up?
North Dakota.
North Dakota. So you went to a small Catholic school there.
I actually went to a one-room schoolhouse for most of my childhood. One of the last people in the U.S. to do it. Grew up on a 6th-generation family farm. And
wow.
Then,
now, where they farm? What'd you farm?
Cattle, mostly cattle. So we about 800 head of Charolais cattle.
Wow, high end.
Yep. Yeah, not exactly, but yeah, our family's been up there for 125 years now, I think, or so.
Wow.
My brother is actually back taking over the ranch now as we speak. So
no crops now. Where in North Dakota?
Hettinger, North Dakota is where I'm from originally. About 15 miles outside of Hettinger in rural Dakotas. But
now Hettinger, I don't really know where that is.
Yeah, I have to. That's
so relative between Bismarck and Minot somewhere.
No, actually, about 4 hours from Minot, 3 hours from Bismarck. We're about halfway. Yeah, about halfway between Bismarck and Rapid City, if you were to drive them. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay, so. A lot of winter up there.
A lot of winter. I went to, grew up in Hettinger and on the farm, and then went to Catholic school in Bismarck, actually, and then law school out in Minnesota before ending up in Los Angeles about 6-7 years ago now.
Yeah, so that's an interesting journey. So, I mean, you're a football player and a wrestler, you said, law school in Minnesota, you even went and passed the bar. So you didn't plan on practicing law? You just had this burning desire to be in sales?
All I ever wanted was revenue operations.
All I ever wanted.
Yeah.
And you needed a law degree to be able to do that.
Yeah, I wish that were true. No, I did practice actually briefly. I am still a licensed attorney. I've maintained my license, which is sort of surprising to people, I think. I practiced for a couple of years out of law school.
What type of law?
Corporate, mostly M&A work. And then I actually, to be totally honest,
you should. This is the show for it.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I probably practiced less than I sold as an attorney, to be honest.
Most
of
like
what I
first
did,
first year associate, they're having you out developing business.
I did a lot of client acquisition in my first couple of years. Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's
A
unusual.
lot of in-person meetings, didn't do a lot of practicing. I still never really know if it was because I was a really bad attorney and they thought that was the way that they should use me, or if I was really good at or at client acquisition. So I'm going to chalk it up to the latter, but know that it probably could have been the former as well.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, because I mean, usually, at least in big firms, because I've done some training for law firms. Actually, did a day-long thing with a group of people for DLA Piper, and talking to their several hundred of their first-year associates they brought together. And it's like, yeah, they don't really let us go out and do that type of thing.
not until years 6, 7, and 8 really is typically where that kicks in. I did a little bit of government affairs work at the firm I was with, Dorsey and Whitney, and there was a very small department there for GA work. And so that was, I became a lot more customer facing, I think, than a lot of my peers because they were in 300 attorney, divisions, and I was in a 6 attorney division.
Right. Yeah. All right. So you decided to shuck the law firm career and go to LA. Why?
Good question. I actually moved to LA. Was still actually practicing out here for about a year when I first got to LA. It was mostly just to get out of the cold winters. You
took California bar as well?
I didn't actually. I was practicing in a manner that I didn't really need to have the California bar. Also, at that point, I was mostly doing client acquisition about 95% of my time.
Got it.
And I was out here for about a year. I met some people at a software company that was in downtown LA, which is where I lived and worked as well. They convinced me to leave law and take the lowest entry-level tech job that I can ever imagine, just to try to make the shift and get into tech, which I was really interested in doing at the time. Sort of quickly entered a company as a CSM, shifted into CS ops and then sales ops and then ultimately revenue ops. And so sort of did that all within a couple of years, actually. And within that time, I did some SDR work, managed SDRs, ran a sales pipeline. I've kind of worn all the hats. And I've been doing sort of director of revenue operations and sales leadership stuff ever since.
Yeah. So for people who aren't really tied into these discussions online, sort of the echo chamber, LinkedIn. So tell them what the difference is between sales ops and revenue ops.
Yeah. There's a huge difference. I think it's actually one of my bigger pet peeves right now. Is that?
Good. Let's dive into it.
Yeah. Let's dive into the pet peeve.
I'll push your button.
Every time we come up with something like revenue operations in tech, a whole bunch of people will give people that title, but not actually do what it means, right? You see a lot of people with revenue operations in their title right now that are actually just sales ops people. And there's one key difference there, which is sales ops people do ops and enablement for your sales team. They're working with companies that are being driven by sales specifically, and they're really running an old go-to-market strategy where sales is the engine behind everything. Revenue operations is taking a look cross-departmentally. So I'm not just showing up and doing sales ops work. It's a piece of it, for sure. It's a big piece of it. Marketing ops is huge. CS ops is huge. I work with finance on ops. I do a lot of legal ops stuff. It's the entire customer-facing journey of your company, your entire GTM strategy is ops, and it's not being driven by one specific division. It's being driven ultimately by the buyer, if we're being, totally candid. But yeah, it's I would say like half the people that call themselves RevOps right now or have RevOps are actually just doing sales ops.
And so again, just to sort of summarize, so sales ops, sort of traditional sales-driven go-to-market strategies. No, I mean, probably some interaction with marketing, but not as aligned. Which is really the difference with revenue operations.
It's like the down funnel interaction with marketing, right? Like marketing creates a bunch of leads and then kicks them to sales. And the sales ops piece of that is making sure that sales gets what it needs from marketing to actually attack those leads. And that's pretty much their interaction with marketing. There's no upstream feedback. There's no helping with the marketing ops in general. There's none of that.
So it becomes the focal point for all that revenue operations does. Do companies have both RevOps and sales ops?
Yeah, we do here, obviously, at ringDNA. It's super important. I mean, you still need people whose sole focus is the sales operation. There needs to be somebody managing Salesforce and doing those sorts of things and just helping out with their day-to-day operations. But there needs to be somebody with that more holistic view as well.
And from a sort of reporting structure standpoint, I mean, how does that work? I mean, sales ops report to revenue ops, or who reports to revenue ops? Anybody, or are you just more of a global facilitator?
I think it can be one or the other, and it depends a bit on your structure. Here at ringDNA, our sales ops analyst rolls into me directly, and that's super helpful because we're super well aligned. Our marketing ops person doesn't; they roll into marketing, and that still works really, really well. We're very closely aligned on a lot of things, and same with CS and finance on that piece as well. I think it really comes down to whether or not you have the authority and mandate to still align everything regardless of the reporting structure.
Yeah, well, isn't that somewhat problematic? Because I know that, and I believe as the ultimate goal as RevOps gets rolled out more broadly, is that almost like a return to the past where there was one person responsible for both revenue, or for both, excuse me, from a revenue standpoint, for both sales and marketing. I mean, isn't that the ultimate goal of alignment, is you just have one final point of responsibility for revenue?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the goal. And it's cross marketing, sales, and CS. I think CS is a huge piece of that.
And CS, I didn't mean to ignore that.
Yeah, no,
sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly the ultimate goal. I actually don't know that I view it as problematic for like our marketing ops team to roll into the marketing umbrella, and I think that's maybe a bit unique to ringDNA. I think at most companies that would be problematic, but at ringDNA, we have Howard, our CEO, William, the CMO, Cameron, our CSO, who are all so oriented around revenue operations as our GTM strategy that it really doesn't seem to matter. I think if you were at a company where that wasn't necessarily the case, you didn't have that level of executive mandate, that it would potentially be problematic. But I haven't run into that issue here.
Interesting. Yeah, I think. Yeah, and personally, I see it on the long run, if you really want this concept to work, which seems to make total sense, is, I said, I think at some point it needs to be unified, because the silos are always going to exist. I mean, they're there whether people feel they're working together smoothly or not, and they may very well be. As you said, it's at some point it's got to be a single vision, a single source of truth, right?
Well, I think you're right, and I think the biggest thing is the only way to eliminate the silos is to create upstream feedback loops. So everything needs to be sort of cross-functional, and it's just definitely going to be a lot easier to do that if it all rolls into one function.
Yeah. So let's talk about, you sort of alluded to this earlier, let's talk about the difference revenue operations will make, let's say, in the buyer experience. So what are you seeing in that regard? Because personally, I think that the sales process and the buyer journey are really completely unaligned at this point.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. Man, it feels like a really big question. I think it's going to be buyer driven, and I think we've talked about meeting the buyer where they are, having it be a buyer driven process for so long in sales specifically, and even marketing. But what that's meant has been like, when you cold call them, help them identify a problem, and then steer that conversation, like meet them where they are on the cold call. And I don't think that that's where this is ultimately going. I think we're getting to a point where we're using data, intent data, in an entire omni-channel presence across sales and marketing, to where buyers are actually signaling to you when they're ready to have conversations and signaling to you what problems they have. And that's when you're bringing in the specific people to field that. And so in that regard, you're not actually, digging in with them to help uncover that. You're letting them uncover their pain points, and then you're helping them solve them. And so it really is buyer driven.
Yeah, though I think I'll differ a little bit on that, because I think that one of the roles that sellers really have to play, which is not one of the areas where it's really not aligned, is buyers need the seller's help to really define the problem they're trying to solve. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think about, take something like the Challenger sale. I mean, really, what's the challenge, right? The challenge is, it's most commonly defined as, well, how do I how do I help you rethink this idea of what it is you think you need to accomplish, right? Which is really sort of how do I help you sort of assume a different, or acquire a different paradigm perhaps about what your problem is and what the scope of it is, what the impact will be of solving it. And like when you go through this is where I think the misalignment exists, is, when you go through a typical sales process, go through the stages of a sales process companies have. And then you go through the stages of the buyer's journey. The terminology is not the same at all. They're not aligned at all. Mm-hmm. And this is not a new problem. This goes back 100 years, but we haven't solved it. Mm-hmm. And we thought that's why I always get amused when I hear people use this term, modern sales. It's like, fine, you've applied technology to this old process, so it's still the old process, right? It's like, when the buyers are going through their journey, their first step is they have to define what the problem is. I think what the intent data does is says, well, look, I've identified a problem, but there's a big difference between identifying it and defining it. And if sellers, you can go through, I did this idly a couple weeks ago. I Googled B2B sales processes and looked at all the graphical representations of it. None of them align to what the buyer is going through.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think part of the problem we're talking about, though, is that you're right. You do have to help, but you're always going to have to help a buyer define the problem they're seeing or frame the problem they're seeing, right?
Sure.
And I think right now, when we have this very much sales-driven process, marketing creates a bunch of leads and then kicks them to sales. And at that point, sales is like, great, so let's dig in and find your problem, identify it, so on and so forth. I think part of this whole journey is to take it to the point where marketing is helping frame that problem or define that problem. By the time they get to sales, by the time they have the level of intent that sales is now involved, they at least have most of that problem identified in their head. And that conversation becomes much easier. We're now not selling them on the problem because they're already partially sold on it. So now we're just affirming that is the problem and then going into the solution mode much more rapidly.
Well, but I think there's a gap there. And so this is where I think, because it would be great, the way you're describing it, if win rates were not so abysmally low as they are in most SaaS companies. Yeah. And then you would say, well, this is working. But the fact is, it's not. The fact is, one of the big gaps is one of the reasons I believe that close rates, not win rates, but even close rates are bad, is that we're not executing that middle part of the funnel where the sales actually takes place. We're getting really good at top of funnel stuff. And with intent data, that helps further. Targeting, that helps further. But then when you first engage with the customer, I think what happens, I know what happens, is that a seller goes in and does some level of discovery and says, oh, okay, I know what the problem is. But what they do is they know what the problem is, but they don't understand what the problem is. Mm-hmm. And there's a huge gap there. And that gap and chasm between knowing and understanding, suddenly you're off on the wrong foot. And this is, I think, where sellers are more consistently successful understand is that, it's not about, I said, knowing, it's about understanding. Because when I understand and I can make the buyer feel understood, I've differentiated myself from everybody else.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But then you look back to the sales process, well, let's do needs analysis and da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, well, none of that tracks to what the buyer's doing. And I think until we get that really aligned, where our stage as a seller is defined with the same exit criteria as the buyers exiting their stage, I think we're always going to have this mismatch. And I think that's to me is a core problem.
Yeah, not just identifying the problem, but understanding it and actually understanding the implications that it has for the customer.
Yeah,
so not just, hey, like this is a big problem because we're not making enough phone calls, but it's a big problem because we're not making enough phone calls because the fewer phone calls we make, the less pipeline we drive.
And what's the impact on that?
The less revenue we bring in, and so on and so forth.
Right? And I think in the majority of cases, what happens, sellers are trained, they have some experience, they ask a sort of a set group of questions that they get familiar with, or whether it's heavily scripted or not. Eventually, everybody sort of has their own personal script, but you got to be willing and able to go off that script because everybody's going to be unique in some respect. And so I just sort of the bigger point is I think that until we're at a point where you look at a sales process and the stages of a sales process and the exit criteria for those stages are equivalent to the buyer's exit criteria for them exiting that stage, I said we're always going to have this mismatch, and it's going to have an impact on people's ability to close business. Because if I could do a pipeline review or not, let's say a one loss deal review, I can almost always find the cause happening during discovery and qualification.
Yeah,
almost universally. And yet, part of the problem is that we treat discovery as this discrete experience, right? We do discovery up front, step 3 in our process, and it's like, well, yeah, but it's not a one and done thing. You have to discover every time you interact with the prospect, because what's happening with them is they're going through their buying process. They're talking to your competitors, they're doing all this work, they're educating themselves, they're getting smarter, they're getting a new perspective on the problem they're trying to solve. And so the discovery you may have done 2 weeks ago may not be valid anymore.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you want to know that?
Yeah, as they continue to flush out the problem, they're going to think of the upstream, downstream impacts, the entire actual impact of the problem they've identified, right?
But we've got discovery as a checkbox in our sales
and we're
process,
done with it, and then we're done,
and we don't revisit it, and the customer evolves. Same thing is true with qualification. Something could look like have good product market fit early in the process, but as they become more sophisticated about the problem they're trying to solve and more educated, maybe not. Or maybe they're really open to you coming in with a unique insight and question to help them sort of rethink what they're trying to accomplish. Presents an opportunity. But if you sort of put a checkbox by it and move on, it's a problem. So this is where, not to get on my soapbox about this, which I just did, but it's my show. I can do that. Is that we've got this sellers marching down a path that just doesn't, for the most part, relate to what the buyer's going through.
It's interesting because there's a way I see that rolling into revenue operations. Actually, specifically, there's sort of 2 things. There's one at ringDNA, we sell software that helps your revenue operation. So I'm for most purposes an example of our target buyer, right? And so when somebody talks to me, like if a seller talks to me and we identify a problem and define it together, I'm thinking of it not just as a sales ops person. I'm not thinking of, hey, we're not making enough calls, as, hey, we're not self-generating enough pipeline. I'm thinking of, we're not making enough calls, which means we're not self-generating enough pipeline. We're also not making enough calls against the leads that marketing is spending a bunch of money to generate. We're not leveraging these 3 softwares properly that we've purchased. So we're not getting our ROI on those. Like, here's the 4 problems that this is causing, and it's actually across 4 different teams, right? And understanding that at the outset helps our sellers much more rapidly help a customer evolve their discovery. So we can identify more of those pain points. I'm also thinking now as we're talking about it, companies with revenue operations people that are truly doing this are going to have a better understanding of these implications. It's going to be less like forming out the problem through a 9-call, discovery process than just somebody there actually understands the implications across 3 different teams instead of just 1. Which I think is missing. And to your point, like when we call, a head of sales and they tell a problem to us, they're thinking of it how this problem associates to sales. And then when they talk to 2 other companies, they might identify this problem also impacts CS, this problem also impacts marketing, but it might take 6 conversations to get there. And we're not getting there sooner because they don't have revenue operations.
Yeah. I think that's, it's valuable. I think that one of the key things that conclusions after 40 plus years doing this that I've drawn is that, and I look at the fact that we're trying to, it's like the movie Groundhog Day, right? Every day you wake up, sales is trying to solve the same problems they've been trying to solve for 100 years, and it's like, well, okay, why is that the case? What needs to change, right? When you read sales books, it's all about the same issues about prospecting. And I could write a book just about the categories of books that are written that people are just sort of repeating, right? And how do you connect? How do you build rapport? How do you do discovery? How do you ask? I can go down through the list, right? So it's like, what needs to change in order to say we're just, we're not getting better at sales? I know this, not to insult more current generations, but you would think that with all the impact of all the technology we've invested in, and it's been developed over the past, certainly last 20 years, for B2B sales, that the productivity of the individual seller, as defined by it, I use the definition of my definition, which is dollars of revenue they generate per hour of selling time, which is the measure of productivity, not activity, but what's productive as revenue. Mm-hmm. When you measure that productivity, the needle hasn't moved in the past several decades. I mean, there's no data that shows that it's moved. In fact, there's anecdotal data that says maybe it's gotten a little worse. Mm-hmm. So, but just assuming it's the same, it's like, how can that be?
It's a great question that I don't know that I have a clear answer to.
Well, yeah, it's more
the rhetorical question.
Right?
Yeah.
Now I'm really disappointed, Jordan. You don't have the answer to that.
The person who can solve that one is gonna.
Well, but I think it gets back to this sort of thing. I think the opportunity with revenue operations and this alignment across departments to say, well, let's relook at what it is sales is really trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the start with when you align your sales process with the buying process, what you're saying is, I'm not really here. My mission is not to get an order for my product. My mission is to help the customer solve a problem.
Right. My next call isn't just a demo because that's the next step in my pipeline. My next call is a demo because that's where we're at. We've identified all the discovery things that we need to identify, and we're ready to do a demo and dive into how we can solve this problem.
Exactly. Because right now, when you look at stages of a sales process, we have our excellent criteria, and that's how we define progress. But it's not at all how the buyer defines progress. Gartner, in their study of buyer enablement 2 years ago, said that actually buyers measure value they receive from sellers by progress towards making a decision. And it's sort of ill-defined what that is, but buyers know it when they feel it, right? Mm-hmm. and so it's like, we check boxes on things we said we've done that don't get us actually closer to actually winning the business.
Well, and it's just a bad buyer experience. Like at the end of the day, if you're just checking boxes for the sake of checking boxes in your stage, the buyer can feel that. They absolutely know that's what's happening.
But that's predominantly what happens.
Absolutely, it is. And it's not because most companies aren't aligning their sales process to where buyers are at. It's a sales back to, we haven't improved in 40 years, 50 years. We haven't really changed from being sales driven in the past 40 or 50 years.
You're absolutely right. That's exactly.
We are still a sales driven world.
Well, I mean, within sales, right. And so, there's been all sorts of lip service given to being, service oriented and buyer centric and so on, but unless it's reflected in the process you implement to work with the buyer, it's never going to change. And I think that's the big thing we've got a perspective change that needs to happen if we want to get serious about really improving what sellers do and becoming of more value to the buyers. Otherwise, we're on these parallel paths. And I think, I'll give you another example of one this one is something I learned about pretty early in my career, but it drives me nuts still that really not enough people pay attention to this. So early in my career, I spent a large chunk of my career selling really expensive communication systems, multi-million-dollar things to big enterprises all around the world. And it dawned on me sort of early as one of the earlier deals I was selling is like, sort of hit me as like I was sort of at a certain point in the stage of the selling process, my selling process. And is at a point after a conversation with the buyer that I knew I was going to win the business. Now, it took me another, in that case, about another 60 days to actually win the order. But from that point forward, I knew I was going in the business. So what happened was, is basically the buyer had made that decision and they based their business case and so on our solution, right? I mean, it largely our solution. It's like one of those things where if you got an RFP and you looked at it and you said, "Oh well, gosh, Andy was all over this, right?"
Yeah, this lines up to exactly what we're selling.
Right. Yeah. And so, but this is every single decision people make about anything, and this has been researched, very well researched. Is there's 2 stages they go through. Just to simplify it, the first stage is I'm going to create options in my mind about how I'm going to solve this problem. And then I'm going to choose one of those options and then go choose somebody to help me solve it. And this is what I was experiencing when I was selling. And it started repeating itself time and time again. On the deals I won, I knew well before, because I knew that the buyer's vision of success was largely based on what I was selling. And so this idea is that buyers, before they make a decision, they make a choice about how they're going to solve their problem. And it's not necessarily completely buyer specific, but it's largely based on a vendor. And Forrester did some research about this a number of years ago. And they said in the B2B world, they were surveying IT buyers. But if you were the seller that was able to formulate the vision of success for the buyer first, that they bought into, your chances of winning were like at 2/3, like almost 65% basically. And it's like, well, that was, to me, it's like, oh yeah, of course, because that's what I've been experiencing throughout my career. So I consciously, and I've written about this in my books, as as a seller, I always want to aim at that first point, because if I don't win that first point, if I don't get chosen by them as the solution, their preferred solution, then I have no chance of winning the business, or my chances are very, very slim. But again, you look at a sales process, it's all based on getting the order. And I use the analogy, like if you were representing a chip company, you're trying to get your chip designed into a larger product. I mean, you have no chance of winning the business if you don't get designed in. And that's basically what this is you got to get yourself designed into their vision of success. Yet it doesn't exist in sales process. And I think it's a huge issue. So it's another one of those things where we're just not thinking about it the right way.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and I actually have a question about this.
Sure.
When you think of it like that first, it's 2 decisions, right? It's the first decision and then the second decision.
I call it a choice, then a decision.
Yeah, choice and then a decision. So we're not orienting around winning the choice. Most companies, I would say all companies are not. Yeah, most is probably weak.
Individuals are orienting themselves around winning the choice. Yes.
Great sellers are, absolutely. Yeah. It also, and this is maybe more of an opinion than any data, it seems to me that you can't force the choice. As in, I can't push you through 4 stages of a pipeline in order to get you. Yeah, I can't get you to make your choice by X date. Right. You need to identify all the problems, feel confident in the solutions that you've come up with in your head, and then, only then, on your own time, are you going to actually be able to make that choice. And I will find out if I've won the choice in order to know if I have a real shot at winning the decision.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it's about right.
Yeah. And nobody's orienting on that.
No, but this is how the buyers are going through it. And Gartner did, again, their buyer enablement study, did their survey of all these buyers. It's basically what they found out.
Yeah,
this is the jobs that buyers have to accomplish. They put slightly different names to it than I do, but again, there was moments when you see that, and he's like, I'm nodding my head because, like, of course, this is what I've known for years. And good sellers have known for years. Is this how people go through their process of making decisions? So to the point is like, we can't. That's why I think that, and this is a whole nother conversation, is I think one of the most unhelpful perspectives we give our sellers is their job is all about persuasion. Because
the job is about helping people.
The job's about helping people. And I posted about this on LinkedIn last week, and I said, it's just the optics, right? Buyers go on a journey. We have a process as sellers, right? Buyers go on a journey without an end destination necessarily in mind, without a defined destination in mind, let's say. And we're going to follow a process with the predetermined destination. And there's a mismatch right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially, I mean, every buyer's journey is going to be different. And you need to account.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you get the gold star for saying that, because there's many people that don't believe that. They think that they're all and they treat them all the same. And
if you can account for like 60% of them being the same, you would be in a pretty consistently happy boat. But even that feels like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's almost like sellers have to sort of have this mindset that they're not selling a standard product, but they're selling a custom solution.
Mm-hmm.
Every time.
Every single time.
With standard elements to it. And I get some of that because I spent that chunk of my career doing just that, selling products that didn't exist. I had a mandate to go out and sell big systems that didn't exist. They didn't exist on paper. Mm-hmm. But to get the customer to sell the customer a vision, have them pay us to develop that for them. And you just acquire sort of a different outlook at that point about even standard product sales. It's like, well, yeah, if you treat them as if they're unique, then they really feel like you're trying to help them.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you're selling, like sell ringDNA, we have a product. We know what the product can do. Mm-hmm. We're selling it. We're selling that product. When you're talking about selling, a system that doesn't exist, and basically you're selling that choice because that's their vision. Like you said, they're forming the vision of how to solve this problem in their head, and then you're earning their trust to the point of they're saying, right, I think this vision is right. I need you to build it for me, which is a whole other sales process, right?
But they're very similar in many respects, though. I mean, even with standard products, that's my point. If you sort of take this approach from the beginning, that, I mean, on one hand, I sort of know because I know what my product does, and we've got certain limitations. But there's lots of ways to sort of create a vision around what the product does and what it will do for you, and that has to be a unique story.
Yeah,
and I always get in trouble with people that are storytelling experts when I say this, is that. I think there's only one story you need to learn how to tell as a seller. That's the buyer's story. Mm-hmm. Right? You need to help them create the story of what success is going to look like. And if you can tell that story, then you're going to dramatically increase your odds of winning the business.
Yeah, and especially if you can tell it early.
Well, exactly.
Right. Like the earlier you know that story, the better it's going to be.
And that's right. And that's why this idea of having sort of a one and done discovery drives me crazy, because it does such a disservice to sellers when we position it that way and train it that way. Is because, again, it's the gap between knowing and understanding, right? Understanding takes a lot more questions, takes a lot more involvement. But when you understand, then you have that credibility, you have that trust to sort of accelerate things that you didn't have if you didn't have it, right? I mean, everybody sort of thinks, a lot of sellers have this idea that buyers go through a process and they go through it at the same rate, at the same time with every seller they're talking to. And it doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because when you start to look at what you've just talked about from like my perspective, from a revenue operations perspective, if you can actually, it'll be really hard to ever truly align all buyers' journeys, right? But if you can train a sales team to do that at the best possible version of it, you would improve your forecasting at an incredible rate. Because identifying early on in discovery, am I going to win the choice or not? If you're not, like somebody comes to you with a pipeline problem, they say, we have a pipeline problem. There's 4,000 ways they can try to fix a pipeline problem, right? Buying ringDNA is certainly on the list of ways to try to fix a pipeline problem, but there are 1,000 other options, and they might not be leaning towards you. And if I can identify early that I'm not going to be the choice, that's not real pipeline. And therefore, that I can forecast more accurately. Yeah. My entire team can forecast more accurately, which now has downstream impacts for my CS team. Am I hiring CSMs to handle all this upcoming deal? Am I hiring implementation managers? This affects my marketing budget. Where are we at on growth opportunities? Are we land and expand? My whole model changes because I'm forecasting differently.
Well, but take the inverse of that, though, which is that because you've reached this level more quickly of understanding with the buyer and qualifying and requalifying as they go through the buying process, I always sort of took guilty pleasure of that because I knew my competitors were spending cycles trying to sell that customer, and they were never going to win because they didn't have that understanding.
So you're setting them back.
I want to occupy as much of my competitors' time as possible, because then they can't go out and work other opportunities. Yeah. So, to me, this was a huge competitive advantage, because you work on a deal that you have a high degree of confidence based on what you know and how you're influencing the choices the buyer's making along the way. That, it's hard to quantify it, because like all forecasts, but you have a much higher probability of winning that deal at that point.
Right. And to your point, if your competitors aren't breaking up with that customer like they should be because they've lost that deal, that is a lot of wasted revenue on their part, not pursuing something they're not going to win. Yeah,
the opportunity cost is huge. Yeah. But you think about it. I mean, when we're in a business, the SaaS business, where most companies are operating sort of that 20% win rate, you're saying, holy cow, that 80%, what are we doing there? Right? How do we get to this point where that's acceptable?
Yeah, 1 in 5.
Yeah, because as I like to tell audiences when I speak, and I've spoken to groups about this, is like, okay, well, what are we training our sellers to do? We're training them to lose, because that's the thing they're getting the most experience doing.
Right. It's not even we're not even matching Major League Baseball for a good hitting percentage at this point, right? We're batting 200 and thinking that's great. Yeah.
And so, I think this again gets back to the point about when you align processes with the buyers, you get to certain points. To your point before is, you have the opportunity to disqualify people out, and part of this comes from other issues outside this, like poor incentives around pipeline coverage and so on that encourage bad behavior of this with bloated pipelines. But again, I think if you get the processes more aligned between buyer and seller, you start addressing some of that problem.
Yeah, and it's tough too. Like what we're talking about is a bit of an earth-shattering thing for a lot of companies, right? And it requires a lot more. We talk about aligning the buying process, but it actually requires stuff from like fundamental shifts for marketing, for example.
Sure.
If we talk about disqualifying somebody earlier on in the process, I probably would want to talk about shifting my definition of what is a qualified opportunity to sometime after that choice is made, right?
Yeah.
Because if they haven't made the choice that sales enablement software is the way to solve this problem, then they're probably not a qualified opportunity. But that has upstream impacts for marketing, who has goals around qualified opportunities. So I need to then have them help me, format this new definition of what is a qualified opportunity, to make sure their goals align to that and that they're marketing towards that goal and that sort of stuff. So it requires a pretty big shift, which, to toot my own horn, is why you need somebody in revenue operations to go do those things and then focus on those conversations. But it's super, super important, obviously.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. I think this unification is another thing that's well past due. And it actually used to be pretty common about 40 years ago. And when I started my career, it was very common to have a VP that was responsible for sales and marketing, but we didn't have the technology at that point. It was much different. It was much harder to align at that point. Because there weren't the tools. You didn't have attribution for the leads coming, all those things. But now there's no excuse. Now it makes perfect sense. So, all right, Jordan, we're running out of time, but we'll definitely have you back. Continue the conversation. It's been great. And if people want to connect with you, how can they do that?
They can certainly obviously connect with me on LinkedIn. Otherwise, I'm available, jordan.henderson at ringDNA.com. And it's been great, Andy. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And do follow Jordan. He's very active on LinkedIn these days. So, all right, we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Andy.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. As always, we're so grateful for your support of this program. And I want to thank my guest, Jordan Henderson, for sharing his insights with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you could also leave us a rating or a review, let us know how we're doing, well, we'd certainly appreciate it. You can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this episode is over. So thank you for your help. And thank you so much for investing your time with me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone. Ever wish you could coach like you've listened to every sales call without actually having to listen to every sales call? Conversation AI from ringDNA uses the power of artificial intelligence to help busy sales managers know exactly where to focus their coaching efforts. Learn which talking points are working and which are falling flat, ramp new reps faster, and help your entire team master the art of conversation. Unlock your team's full potential with the power of AI. Learn more at ringdna.com/CAI. That's ringdna.com/CAI.